can you start by just introducing yourself and then, well, okay, wait, pause. So you're planning on posting this on your YouTube as well, right?
Correct. Yep.
Okay, so we should do a thing where both of us introduce ourselves then, probably. Um,
Yes.
just so we have that. So you can go first, introduce
Okay.
yourself, and then I'll introduce myself if that works for you.
Yeah, no, that works. Hi, I'm Poe.Darcy. I am an author. I have two manuscripts currently in progress, one of which is currently being edited, and I actually just finished the first draft for a fantasy fairy tale retelling, and then the one that's being edited is a YA contemporary. I'm a Christian, and so I don't write Christian fiction, but I do try to present the gospel in a way that's palatable to mainstream audiences with my story. That's kind of like one of my main things, and just bringing glory to God with my writing. The reason that we're here today is that I recently hosted a Hunger Games reread in the in the run up to the release of the new book Sunrise on the Reaping. And so we're just here to talk all things Suzanne Collins and Hunger Games.
Very excited. I'm very excited.
Yeah.
My name is Julia Witmer. I am also a Christian author, and I have published two books with another one on the way. Ophelia Brown and the Mythical Menagerie is book two in the Ophelia Brown series, and it's coming out on July 1st, which is very exciting. And that date is coming up very quickly. So I'm looking forward to that. I am just really excited to be here to interview you and just ask you some questions about your read through and even how it's impacted your writing process and that kind of thing. So I'm really excited. Yeah.
I am too. By the way, if you haven't read Ophelia Brown and The Unseen, I would definitely recommend it. um, yeah, Julia is a very good writer.
Thank you so much. I loved watching your review that you posted. It just was so encouraging and like honest, but like so it was just so good. I really appreciated that. Thank you for that.
Good, I'm glad.
So let's go ahead and dive into the questions.
Yeah,
Sorry, this is a bit of an overarching question, so take your time to think about it if you need to.
yeah, no worries.
But what were some things that stuck out to you in this read through that you haven't noticed before?
You're right, that is a big question. And so so a little bit of background. I read Hunger Games, the entire series for the first time the summer between like sixth grade and seventh grade. And then I didn't read it in its entirety at all after that. I did read The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes about a year ago, a year and a half. And so that one's a little bit fresher. I didn't reread that one though. And so rereading the original trilogy was kind of like reintroducing me to a whole like world that I kind of had like tucked away in my brain. Like there were things that I still remembered, but I think I had more I definitely had more retention skills, reading it as an adult, and so I was able to understand more, I think, of what was going on, as well as like the meaning behind a lot of it. I'm trying to think of specific things that really stuck out. Oh, okay. So this is if you've seen some of my videos that I did as content during the Hunger Games reread, you probably get the gist that I don't like Gale. Like at all. And I liked him even less in this read through because I was I was very young when first read it. I had never been in like a meaningful romantic relationship of any kind, and now I'm married.
Right.
And so I like kind of I hope, by God's grace, I have a better understanding of what a healthy relationship looks like. And there was just so much like blatant toxicity that I saw in Gale's approach to his and Katniss's relationship that I didn't like. I like there were times I literally like I had a pencil with me and I would like kind of jot down things that I noticed because I knew that I wanted to have discussion topics for my Discord server and like topics for content and stuff. And I think at the bottom of the page where Gale and Katniss are talking about running away from 12 and catching fire, I just wrote, Gale, none of this is about you. Like, so that's definitely something that stood out. I think also being an adult, I just have like a more solid understanding of politics. And so I think definitely understanding it better and it more stood out to me how control of the narrative really impacts and affects a government's relationship with its people,
Right.
and how it can lead to the economy of oppression that we see in the Hunger Games.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that is crazy. I think that's one of the things that's a big thing that you can miss when you're a younger reader, that you come
Yeah,
back as an adult and you have this like much bigger perspective on the world and on how things work. And then it's like right in your face, crazy, insane. I was just rereading Suzanne Collins' first series that she published, the middle grade series, Gregor the Overlander. Highly recommend. So good. It was my favorite when I was a kid. It's my favorite still, but she tackles a lot of the same topics of just like the cruelties of war and like all of these things, and they totally went over my head when I read it the first time as a kid,
right.
but I was reading it as an adult and I was like, oh my goodness, this is intense and so good. She handles those topics so well and with such grace,
Agreed.
but
Yeah.
just like yeah, so well, so well. So on that note, was there anything in that like realm that really stuck out to you that made you think maybe more than you had before about topics like war or the cruelty that can be in war or anything like that?
So that interesting that you're asking me that now because I'm definitely like had more time to kind of ruminate on that, having just finished Sunrise on the Reaping. I finished it like an hour ago. And so I did a couple of live streams, is like giving people the opportunity to read with me and kind of like have a bit of chat together. And a term that I kept using that I didn't really like kind of process the meaning of until afterward was economy of oppression. And the reason that I say that is that that is like that is how the government of Panem works.
Right.
Is like basically constant power plays that moves and counter moves is something that Plutarch and say back and forth to not only like put yourself in a position of power, but in order to do that you have to put somebody under you. And we see a lot of that in like not just like the capital versus the districts. It's like that's part of the reason that Mockingjay ends the way it does because Katniss knows that Coin is going to do the same thing.
Right.
And so, but something that kind of led me to consider is that war doesn't happen in a vacuum. And I think that a lot of YA fiction that has come out like to that vein of like Harry Potter, has a lot of like war themes in it, and the Hunger Games and Maze Runner. I didn't even read that one, but I know that it has this kind of themes in it. I think that the war theme can be so prevalent that sometimes we don't always stop to discuss the things that lead up to war.
Mhm.
And because yes, war is horrible, like it is heartbreaking, but it's not like an entity that functions without some kind of catalyst. And in the case of the Hunger Games, that catalyst was pride, greed, a desire for power on the part of not just Snow and his family, like there, were a lot of people who came before them and who worked with them in that, but he ended up kind of monopolizing, that economy, and oppression. And that's the thing is like if you, it, I think it's actually, yeah, I just heard this quote last night from Dumbledore from Harry Potter, is that tyrants live in fear of the people that they oppress
Mhm.
because they know that at some point somebody is going to rise up and stand up against them.
Mhm.
And so that is ultimately what breeds war in the Hunger Games. And so I just think that that's something that's important for people to recognize and for us to keep in mind when we're talking about war in general, and especially when we're like analyzing literature that handles the subject, is that it's never going to function as its own entity. Like it always has to derive from somewhere.
Yeah, those are some wise words.
Thank you.
So, what was something that you really liked about the storytelling that kind of helped to communicate that narrative and that understanding just like in Suzanne Collins' storytelling capabilities? What was something you really liked?
Oh, I would say the kind of like opposition that a lot of the characters who are on the same side find themselves at, or like the opposition of ideals or concepts. An example of that being Katniss wakes up after the quarter quell and catching fire, and she is just like livid. I mean, she's feeling a lot of things, but she's also just very angry with Haymitch and Plutarch because they, and from her perspective, pushed her into a rebellion or like an uprising or whatever we want to call it, that she did not consent to being a part of. And I don't think that that's an unfair assessment of the situation, but it is like it does ultimately end up working for the greater good, but only because Katniss consents to it later. I think if she hadn't, and if they had just like continued to push her or like maybe even use some kinds of like means of war to force her to be like the image of the rebellion, I don't think that it would have worked out the way it did. And I think, and another example is like kind of the juxtaposition between Katniss and Gale when it comes to approaching the rebellion, because Katniss, she only gets involved in the Hunger Games because she wants to save her sister. They're like, the idea of like being the first volunteer of 12, she's not looking for any sort of notoriety for that. She's not looking to, start like fan any kind of flame or anything. It really is just looking to do what's best for her family because that's where her values always laid and what her responsibility always was. Whereas Gale, under the exact same circumstances, like I mean, their dads died in the same fire, and they took on the same family responsibilities. Ended up with a very much more like adamant and vehement rage against the Capitol, which was actually beneficial in a way because he understood who the enemy was, but to a point that he lost the plot a little bit. Whereas Katniss had to be pushed to even recognize the Capitol as an enemy rather than an entity that makes decisions for her that she has to, I guess, like learn to deal with, I guess. And so, yeah, so I think that that vehicle of like having different people have different like perspectives on the same situation, which I mean, it's not like a new thing, but I think in a circumstance like that, it's really easy to kind of like have the people who are in the rebellion or like the people who are rising up against the government kind of all have the same face, of like we don't like this, we're taking the government down, and everything, but kind of like making them people. I think it, I don't know, it facilitates conversation around approaching, you know, fights for freedom and fights against oppression wisely, I think, because if we can't if we can't listen to each other, then how are we going to have a peaceful um you know place to live at the end of everything?
Yeah.
um and so I think that that kind of like, because I mean, you asked if there was anything that I like that kind of facilitated those ideas, and I think that that kind of does come back to the idea that war doesn't happen in a vacuum, because if you build an economy or society out of people who aren't willing to listen to one another and aren't willing to, I guess, like, I'm trying to find a way to put this, like unconditionally look for justice and for the well-being of their fellow man, then we're not going to end up in a peaceful society, and it is going to kind of continue a cycle of power, like power grabbing, hunger for like being over others, oppression, war, and it's, if we like can't get down to the heart of it, which ultimately comes with accepting people whose views are different from yours and learning to work with them, then we're like the cycle just keeps going on.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is going to get a little bit political, so you can feel free to like totally like skip this part out, but I'm just curious about your opinion on this based on what you said, so you can edit this out later if you don't want anything political. But I was
And it
just
was
curious how you see that being relevant in our culture today. Like, do you see it being relevant? and timely? And if so, like in what ways do you see that message being relevant?
Um, okay, so I'm not going to take like a political stance, like on either side of the
Yeah.
aisle, when I say this. But, and this is actually, I think, something I do want to share publicly. Something I have noticed, and I notice it most in social media, I think because those are the circles that I'm in currently right now. But I think that if I were in a different like circle of society, I would see the same thing more than likely. Excuse me. Our society is very prone to polarizing.
Mhm.
And that to me causes us to kind of like it's the popular opinions end up being the only ones that matter.
Mhm.
And so I'm trying to think of an example that I can use that I would be comfortable with.
Right.
Okay, well, let me use this as an example. So do you remember when the election happened and people were talking about, can we keep politics out of book talk? Like books shouldn't be political, that sort of thing. And people were like, there were like backlash against that. I don't disagree. I do think that books are inherently political, and the ability to have a free exchange of ideas is like inherently political because it gives us the opportunity and facility to participate in politics. Having said that, something that I've noticed is that if you search books are political, then you're going to get a influx of videos of people arguing that idea.
Mm.
And then if you search the books aren't political, you're going to get not necessarily the same videos, but the same like influx of information of people arguing that books are political.
Mm. Mhm.
And so then to me, that ends up being like a general consensus around a popular, like the opinion that's popular.
Wow.
And now the thing is, again, I don't think they're wrong, but if that can happen in a scenario like that, where maybe it's not a fact, but it is something to consider, about the mode of communication, of books and other kinds of media like that. If it can happen with an opinion like that, it can happen with other things, like, other like opinions, other um thoughts on things that are going on. And the popular opinion isn't always going to be the one that's right.
Wow.
And I'm not, and I say right, like I don't think that opinions are necessarily right, but there are times where there is a distinct right and wrong.
Yeah.
And I don't think that a society where speech and discourse tends to, like gravitate toward what's popular, um, leaves room or opens up the like discernment for what's right and wrong, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's so interesting because I feel like you can see that in like all different kinds of topics too. Just this
Yeah.
idea of like what's popular. If you disagree with that, you're like immediately wrong, even on things
Mhm.
that aren't like right or wrong. Like if there's a movie that everyone's like, "Oh, this is awful," or "I can't believe that the main star of this is doing whatever," and you're like, "I don't see anything wrong with it," right? Then everyone's like, "You're dumb." Can't believe you would believe that, you know? And so, yeah, I feel like it can be concerning, like when it's something as simple as a movie, which is a subjective opinion. Like that is totally
Right.
subjective.
Yeah.
You can totally enjoy a movie that might not be objectively good, and it can subjectively be really good, you know? And
Right.
so like if we can't have discourse on something as small as that, right? Then how can we expect to be able to have discourse on those bigger things down the line? So,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. So, backtracking a little bit, because you said
Yeah.
something that
Yeah.
was really interesting earlier about the difference between Katniss and Gale, and
Mhm.
their like mentalities towards the Capitol. Um, I was wondering if you could think of any examples of Katniss and her mindset towards the Capitol and its difference to Gale, like in specific scenes or something that it feels like if she had a different mindset, she would have reacted differently or anything like that. it was just a really interesting take that you had. I wanted to hear more on it.
Okay. So I think actually the first scene that we see them together is a good example of this because Katniss, I think I don't remember the exact verbiage, but she actually basically like in her internal monologue says, I mean, what does it matter if it's unfair?
Mm.
Like which for her, like in a survival, situation like they're in, I can understand for sure. But she's more of like she's very practically minded. She's very like she has really good survival instincts and like protective instincts as well. And that's what drives her. And I think that if but she doesn't have an inherent like hunger for justice. It's something that I have noticed about her character. And I think that if she had that the conversation that she and Gail were having about how horrible the Hunger Games were, and like his I mean, and even like when they go to visit the mayor, he's like really like lashing out at the mayor's daughter because she doesn't have to take the tesserae. So excuse me. So she doesn't have her name in there as many times. Like he I think he also has really good survival and protective instincts. But he has the very strong sense of and hunger for justice that kind of like pushes him to make different decisions than Katniss necessarily would. Like when it comes to in Catching Fire, when she wants to run away because she knows like how dangerous everything is for her and her family, with all the threats that Snow is putting up and everything. When he finds out that there's a rebellion going on, he's like, no, I'm not leaving. I'm staying here. Which is interesting because it's like they both have the same responsibilities. Like they both have like a family to take care of, and they both know that things are kind of heating up. And I think that he knows how dangerous that could be for his family, but he makes the decision of I'm going to stay and I'm going to help people fight because that is that is where my values are. Is I mean, and I'm not saying he always does it well, and I'm not saying he's always like a great person about it, but like pursuing, justice and standing up against what I believe is wrong. Whereas for Katniss, her, unconditional protective instincts kind of show in that scenario as well, because all she wants to do is protect her family, even if that leaves people in her district is still being oppressed, and even if that never changes anything. And I think if I don't know. I don't know like what part of her character might have changed that for her. Like if there's something that like could have happened differently in her past that could have like led to a different mindset that might have led her to make different decisions. Like maybe if her dad had, continued living, then she might have been kind of directed in a different way, because she wouldn't have had to take on all of the responsibility for taking care of her family. And I don't we don't really hear much about like what Mr. Everdeen thinks about the circumstances and stuff, but she would have a different voice in her life. Um, so yeah, that is an interesting question. But that's kind of where I see the difference is they both have killer survival instincts and protective instincts. I think they just because of different values they have choose to exercise them in different ways until Katniss is put in a situation where she I don't want to say has no choice because she definitely had one, but even her decision to become the Mockingjay was built from her desire to protect Peeta and make sure that he had immunity after speaking out against the rebels. And so that was still her protective instincts and her like also I think in a certain way like her sense of personal justice, like feeling like she owed him to protect him, more motivating her, and it continues to throughout the entire book than any sense of like overall justice or like ending of the oppression that she ended up achieving by being Mockingjay.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for your insight on those characters. I really like listening to people break down characters and like how they interpreted them and because characters are my favorite part of story. I just really love characters. When I have book ideas, they always start with a character and then whatever story needs to happen for that character to reach their completion is the story that happens after the character exists, if that makes sense.
Okay.
So I really like hearing people like break down characters. So thanks for giving me your thoughts on that. I really enjoyed it. Um,
Of course.
so, on a similar note, since I love characters so much, what are some strengths that you think Suzanne Collins has with creating characters and communicating them, especially from such a limited POV, right? Because it's first person, present tense. So you can't head hop, right? You can't go to other people's perspectives, which is hard, but I think she does it really well, right? So, what are some of those strengths, and do you think that there are any weaknesses? In those character development.
Okay. Interesting question. So, the first thing that popped into my head when you said strengths is there are probably going to be some people who disagree with me on this, but Suzanne Collins writes 16, 17, 18 year olds like 16, 17, 18 year olds. And I think, especially in like dystopian fiction, it is really easy to write characters who have like emotional maturity and like mental dexterity and like just sophistication of thought that is far beyond like 10 years beyond their actual age. And I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing because you are going to have to grow up faster in an environment like that one. And Katniss certainly did, but she definitely still like her, I don't know, she just to me sounded like someone who was the age that she said that she was going to be. And I don't mean that in a bad way at all. I just mean like she, I know, like, I don't want to say like innocence because there's definitely a lot of jadedness there, but it is, in my opinion, unreasonable under any circumstances to assume that a 12-year-old, I think is the age she was when her father died, is 4 years later going to have like a completely adult and like, I mean, most adults can't even really like bear those emotions well under normal circumstances, let alone the, like oppressive regime that she was a part of that if you depending on who you ask, it's probably what orchestrated her father's death. So, like in those circumstances, it makes sense that she kind of like pushes it down in a way that's like what I see her character do. And again, that to me is like an age appropriate reaction for somebody in that circumstance. Especially somebody who's been like saddled with adult responsibilities. And the same thing I think goes for Peta. I mean, and again, this is something that a lot of adults would struggle with. But when he finds out that the relationship that they've had was for her a part of an act when it was real for him, he doesn't like immediately handle it with, grace, or like understanding it, to him, that was like the first real relationship that he's ever had. And it was in a life or death situation with somebody that he's had a crush on forever. It took him some time, and sometimes he acted like kind of a jerk about it, for him to process it. And so I think like being consistent about that, especially is one of her biggest strengths, is like the people who are adults in the circumstance act like adults. That's not always like a good thing,
Yeah.
you know. And actually, I think that that's more realistic because of the life or death circumstances. A lot of the adults expect adult behavior and adult like strength and fortitude out of the children. And I think, yeah, so I think realistic relationship dynamics and realistic just like maturity of character is something that Suzanne Collins does really well. I was actually thinking about that while I was reading Sunrise on the Reaping as well, because all of her books are told by some are like told from the like primary point of view of somebody who is a child. I think except for Snow was 18, but still, he was still in school, and so he still like had that kind of focus and those responsibilities. And so, and that's again, that's just hard to do. It's hard to do that well, like put children in an adult circumstance and still have them breathe like children.
Ah,
Um, for one thing I will say, I don't know that I'd say that this is a weakness, but I personally like desired more out of like, I don't know, just kind of like the emotional processing and depth of the characters. And I think that sometimes that just, varies on character. It could just be a matter of preference, but that's the only thing that I could think of that I think would be a weakness because of the pacing of the stories. They're usually very fast paced. Sometimes like emotions can get glossed over, which in some cases actually works really well because again, if you're in a life or death scenario and your friend just died in front of you, you're not going to stop and like have a normal grieving moment in that because your survival instincts kick in. But sometimes I think that it does kind of become like like a root thing for how the characters kind of, process emotions, and that can become a little detaching.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really interesting. That's really interesting. So, was there anything like in her writing, in her storytelling, character development, plot, all of it, that you feel is going to or has inspired your own writing?
Oh, okay. Well, I was writing a first draft
Mhm.
while I was reading, and I did notice like, hmm, something that I have noticed about Suzanne Collins that I think is kind of like lost in a lot of writing advice because you want to be subtle, you want to like show and not tell, and I do think that that's a good piece of advice, but I do think that sometimes it can go too far in that direction, at least for me personally, where I feel like I'm never allowed to like tell anything ever. And so actually having characters acknowledge their own emotions, I think is a big part of storytelling. And that's something that I found myself more comfortable being able to do while I was writing and reading Hunger Games at the same time, because that is something that Suzanne Collins really good at. Um, yeah, I'm sure that there are more. Well, also like focusing on elements of the story that are important. So like not like describing every single thing in every single room or piece of setting in explicit detail, but like focusing on the things that you want the reader to recognize and that you the reader or you the writer know are going to be important to the story, so it can signal to the reader, hey, this is important, keep an eye on this. That's something that I've tried to implement, especially because I'm writing fantasy for the first time. And so it's really easy to get kind of caught in the weeds of that, of like, oh, well, the vase was this color and stuff like that. But if the color of the vase does not end up being important at any point, then it's usually good enough to just tell the reader that there was a vase somewhere. like, um, so I think that Suzanne Collins handles that really well, and it's kind of like helps me put into perspective how to handle those kinds of dynamics, not even just with description of setting, but like character actions and
I think this is probably going to be the last question I have off the top of my head. Um,
okay.
but I'd also love to hear anything else you want to talk about the series. But was there anything you noticed in Suzanne Collins' writing style that changed between the older, like the original trilogy, and this new story? Because it's been a while, right, since those books.
Yeah.
So I'm just interested in knowing you feel like there's anything that's changed drastically. You feel like it's pretty much the same and that's not a bad thing, or yeah.
Oh, that's an interesting question. Um, So the first thing that's kind of coming to mind, and I don't know if this is a style thing, but it is definitely like, uh, so I'm trying to find a way to describe this without giving anything away.
Right.
But you can probably, if you've been online, then you will probably see that a criticism that Sunrise on the Reaping is receiving is that it's too fan servicey. I do not agree. But I do like having read the book myself, I do understand why people are saying that. And so I think, and I will never have read this book without having read the original trilogy, and I would not recommend that. If you want to read Ballad before the original trilogy, I think that could actually enhance the experience because you'd have like some background for Snow, but it wouldn't like spoil anything from the original for you. But if you're gonna read them in like any order other than first three first, and then Ballad, and then Sunrise on the Reaping, I would say Ballad, and then original trilogy, and then Sunrise on the Reaping. Um, excuse me. But it's weird kind of going into a book where like it's like there's nothing new, you know? And I don't know if that was like a result of her writing style or just like a result of me having read the books beforehand, but it's like there is so much like I'm trying to find a way to say this without spoilers.
Yeah.
Um, like there are just callbacks to the original, and it's interesting reading those, but like trying to process the Sunrise on the Reaping as its own story. Um, I mean, and the entire thing is based on a lot of information we already had. I think that three of the five story beats are already contained in Catching Fire, or at least like could be extrapolated from it. Um, and so, yeah, I guess it's like kind of like she was starting with framework that was already established and just kind of like adding to it rather than in the first book where it's like it's a whole new universe. You have to like process everything again, like for the first time, or again, if you're like reintroducing yourself to it. Um, but then there's also like one thing I will say that I do think is a little bit different, and it's a really like minor part of the story for both of the prequels, but she does go into less detail explaining the Hunger Games each time, is something I've noticed. And so that is something that I would caution people to be aware of is that I do feel like Suzanne Collins writes the prequels as assuming that the people who are reading them have read the first trilogy. Um, Again, for Ballad, I don't think it would ruin anything or any of your experience reading either book to read Ballad first. But for that reason, I would not recommend reading Sunrise on the Reaping before reading the original. Did that answer your question?
No, it did. It's so
Okay.
to see how like because obviously a writer is still the same writer, right? But
Yep.
subtle things can change over time. I just think are really interesting to hear about just like the way they tackle story or the way that they like the things they focus on, things they don't focus on, like you're saying. So that is really interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Um, I don't think I have any more specific questions. Was there anything you wanted to talk about and like just dive into about any of the stories, characters, world, anything like that?
Well, I did kind of want to hear about your experience with the Hunger Games, like, when you read them, I are like how much of a part of your life they are, I guess, in the present.
Yeah. So I actually haven't read the whole trilogy, which is something that's
Oh, okay, my bad.
so I
Oh,
know the whole series because my
okay.
older sister loved it. So
Okay.
when she was reading it, she like told me everything. I was just like experiencing them through her. I
Okay,
read
good.
the first book when I was way too young to read it and enjoy it, and so I'm planning on going back and trying to read through them again.
Yeah,
Because like when you were talking about going back and reading through them, I was like, man, I want to join, but I don't have any time right now. But this would be like the perfect opportunity to read it because I haven't read all of the books. But I love the movies. I know that's probably like, oh, you haven't read the books, but you love the movies. But I do love the movies. I think they're really good.
they're great.
Um,
Yeah.
so the story, the characters have been a big part of my life because my sister really liked the stories and she told me about all of them. And then I watched all of the movies and I read the first book. Um, but yeah, I'm not like huge into the lore as much as some other people are, which is one of the reasons I'm like so interested in hearing your thoughts and opinions on it as someone who just reread them. Because yeah, I'm really interested in the world and in the characters, but I haven't gotten around to reading all three of them yet. So,
Gotcha. Okay. Um, that makes sense. I had a little bit of like a mini heart attack when you said you hadn't read them because I was just like, oh my gosh, I have just been like sharing literally everything.
oh, don't worry, it's not a spoiler because again, like I know the stories. Um,
Good.
So, and my younger sisters, I have two sisters. I have an older sister, a younger sister.
Gotcha.
My younger sister really liked Ballad when it came out. And so she was telling me all about it when it came out. Like she told me like everything about it. I was like, I didn't even get a chance to read it, but she's like, but you have to read the whole trilogy first. So I'm just gonna talk about it because I don't have anyone to talk to about it. So I know a lot about it, like the whole like when being in your head versus the movie where you're not in his head and it's like you could totally walk away with a different interpretation. Like we had long
Yeah.
conversations about that I thought were really interesting. Um, but yeah, that's my experience. I am a huge Suzanne Collins fan because, like I said, I love Gregor the Overlander. Like it's my favorite. I love Gregor the Overlander so much. Um,
Yeah, I gotta read that one. I did you know that I just found this out? She also like wrote some episodes of Little Bear.
Yeah, I heard that. I was
Just, I
this.
mean, everybody's got to start somewhere, but
Yeah, it's
I was just like, that was because I used to watch that show when I
yeah.
was little.
Me too.
Um, that was, yeah, that was interesting.
Yeah.
So, do you have a favorite character from the movies?
I think so. When I was younger, I would have said probably um Katniss, but I
Yeah,
really like Haymitch and Peeta. I just think they're very
yeah,
well-written characters that are complex and interesting. And yeah, I don't know. I really like them. And that's one of the reasons I really want to read the stories because I feel like you get so much more rich,
yes.
like character development in the books. I'm like, this is just scratching the surface in these movies. So how much better can they be in the books? I have to know. But
Peeta is the best, for sure. I will say Haymitch is very different
yeah,
in the books than he is in the movies.
really.
Um, I like Haymitch, but I think I prefer movie Haymitch if I'm being perfectly
Yeah.
honest. Um, oh, okay. So actually, as someone who watched the movies, I was rewatching them too recently, like right after I finished the reread, and I had this thought watching Snow's like interactions with his granddaughter, and it like I don't know. It kind of like changed the character for me. I'm actually thinking about making an entire video about book
Yeah.
Snow versus movie Snow because we know he has a granddaughter in the books, but we don't really get any like interactions or anything with her. Excuse me, but there are some really key scenes between him and her where he does kind of like just act like a grandfather, and I wanted to kind of get your take on this. I think like my headcanon in that is that to the extent that he was able, he in the movies, he does love his granddaughter. I do think it's interesting his wife and child seem to be conveniently not in the picture.
Yeah.
But I do see like a very again, to the extent that he's able, like he's still not a good person, but
Right.
like I do think he, I mean, because like when he sits down with her, they're having dinner and she's had her hair in the braid, and he isn't even like putting it together that that's related to Katniss, and he just says, "Oh, I like your hair. When did you start wearing it like that?" And I was just like, I recognize that moment. I have like good relationships with my grandparents, and I recognize that moment of like, "Oh, you look very, you look very nice today. You did something different with your hair and stuff," and it's like it makes me uncomfortable almost to think that like there's a version of Snow in any of the adaptations that actually
Hmm.
loved somebody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It makes me wonder because it's like, I don't know, because he seems to very much be the kind of person who picks people based on their value to him, what they can
Yes.
bring to the table. So it's so interesting to see him interacting with someone who really doesn't bring any kind of value, right? It's not like she has any kind of influence. She doesn't have like all the value she has is that she's his granddaughter, right?
Yeah.
So that does feel like odd, and I don't even know how to word it, but it feels like strange. Like, are we seeing a genuine interaction or is that like put on in some way? But if it was, like, why would it be? Like, there's no reason to pretend like you like your grandkid, right?
Right. Well, I think so something Snow is has to know at some point in his life that he is not going to be there forever. And
Mhm.
so my only thought on that is that maybe she was like an heir of some kind that he could like that could like continue the Snow line once he was gone, and so the future that he's trying to build, he's building up for her. But I do think there has to like you said, even if he manipulates everyone else in his life very differently. And so like you said, there's no reason for him to actually like pretend that he likes her.
Right.
And so that kind of even if, a lot of it is driven by like a desire to for somebody to carry on his legacy, does lead me to believe that that is driven by some like genuine affection for her, which again makes me uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But also then thinking about that little girl who after his death had to live on, and like knowing what he did and like being made aware of the crimes against humanity and like the war crimes that he committed. And but that was like a side of him that only she would see is the like love that he had for her in whatever capacity it was present.
Yeah.
Um, and that would like I would like to read that story.
Yeah.
Like, we're getting a lot of prequels. I would love to read that like sequel of kind of her story of processing that and like finding a way to move on because I my great grandfather died about 2 years ago, and that was a very difficult experience for me. But I just kind of imagined what that would be like to know of this man who loved me very much, and like who took care of me and stuff like that, and then to find out posthumously that he like actually was a horrible person and like killed a bunch of people and did some really horrific things, like finding a way to like reconcile and divorce those two
Right.
memories. That would be like, I just, like I said, I would love to read that. And I think Suzanne Collins could probably like write that very well.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. She would be able to handle that so well. She handles such complicated things with such grace. It's
Yeah.
incredible. Yeah. How about you tell us how
Yeah.
to find you online?
So at Poe.Darcy.Author on TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram. And I have a newsletter called On the Journey with Poe Darcy, which will be linked in bios of Instagram and YouTube. TikTok doesn't allow clickable links in bios. There I post monthly book recommendations, writing updates, and just like anecdotes from my personal life. And it's just really just a way for me to keep people updated on my writing journey outside of social media. And yeah, that's pretty much it. What about you?
You can find all the information about me at juliawitmer.com, or find me most social media platforms at Julia Witmer, author.
Nice, nice. All right. Well, thank you for taking time for me today, Julia. This was really fun.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun. Thank you for joining me.
Of course.